The silence of the Athelian hegemony was its greatest weapon, a profound and deliberate emptiness that had been cultivated over 10 millennia of absolute dominion. It was a silence born not of peace, but of perfection, a state so meticulously engineered that conflict had become a forgotten artifact, a relic of lesser, chaotic species. On the command deck of the Eternal Resolve, the hegemony's flagship, this silence was a physical presence, shimmering in the filtered light of a captured nebula and reflecting off the flawless chrome of the bulkheads. At the center of it all stood Imperator Vorlog, his form encased in ceremonial armor that had not tasted the scorch of battle for generations, his gaze fixed on the hologram suspended before him. It was a derelict, a ghost ship of unknown origin, tumbling end over end in the void. Its design was offensively asymmetrical, a chaotic jumble of modules and engines that spoke of a desperate, brutish pragmatism. It was ugly, functional, and utterly fascinating to prognosticator Lyra, who stood at the Imperator's side, her own slender frame a stark contrast to his monolithic presence. The vessel, she explained, her voice a soft melody that barely disturbed the quiet, was a relic of a species designated Cycle 7 Variant H, otherwise known as humans. They were believed to have self-annihilated centuries ago, a footnote in the grand, serene annals of the galaxy. Their home system, a volatile yellow star, had been quarantined under a standing edict against observing primitive self-destruction. Yet here was their refuse, drifting in the pristine currents of hegemonic space. Vorlog made a sound of dismissal, a low thrum that vibrated through the deck plating, an echo of a failed species. He declared, its final gasp, a piece of floating junk. He gestured for the ship to be disintegrated, but Lyra held up a hand, a gesture of profound insubordination that only her station permitted. The ship's materials, she urged, were remarkably resilient. Its energy core, though long dead, showed signs of a controlled reaction that was, by their standards, recklessly inefficient, yet powerful. And its data logs, though fragmented, spoke not of a final, glorious self-immolation, but of an exodus. They fled something, she whispered, not themselves. Vorlog turned his helmeted head, the motion slow and deliberate, the golden optics within dimming with irritation. The only thing a species like that flees from is its own inherent chaos. Prognosticator, they are a cautionary tale, a dissonant note in the great cosmic symphony. Their end was inevitable, a mercy they administered to themselves before we were required to. But the logs, she pressed, contained star charts that were impossibly advanced for such a primitive culture, pointing to regions of space even the hegemony had deemed too unstable for colonization. They were not just running, they were running somewhere specific. The Imperator finally lost his patience, his voice booming in the silent chamber, causing technicians to flinch at their consoles. Enough. This obsession with a dead race is unbecoming. Their chaos is a plague, and this vessel is its carrier. Erase it from the stars and task a scout fleet with tracing its trajectory. If any remnant of this human infection persists, we will grant them the serene finality they failed to achieve on their own. It is our duty, as gardeners of the cosmos, to prune the weeds. Lyra bowed her head, the silver circlet on her brow catching the light. As you command, Imperator. But as she retreated to her station, a deep disquiet settled in her soul. She had studied the patterns of galactic history for centuries, and she knew that chaos, once sown, did not simply die out. It adapted, it learned, and it often returned with a vengeance that serenity was ill-equipped to counter. Far from the hegemony's sterile perfection, in a listening post carved into a rogue asteroid designated Aegis Station, Dr. Eris Thorne was surrounded by the ghosts of human chaos. His world was a library of war, a digital archive containing every conflict humanity had ever waged, from the first rock thrown in anger to the last corporate skirmish over asteroid mining rights. His job was not to celebrate this history, but to pathologize it, to understand the frantic, violent pulse that beat at the heart of his species so that it might one day be controlled. He was a historian of bloodshed, a scholar of survival, and he believed, with an almost religious fervor, that humanity's greatest threat was, and always would be, itself. That was why the signal he was observing was so deeply unnerving. It wasn't a signal at all. It was its absence. For weeks, a deep space sensor array in the Perseus arm had been going quiet. Not a sudden silence, but a creeping one, as if a wave of absolute null was slowly advancing through the sector. Background radiation, quasar pulses, the faint chatter of distant stars, all of it was being methodically erased, smoothed over into a perfect, unnatural void. It was the cosmic equivalent of a predator holding its breath. He brought his findings to Commander Eva Rostova, the military governor of the Outer Arm Defense Coalition. Rostova was a woman forged from the harsh realities of interplanetary conflict. Her face a roadmap of hard decisions and necessary losses. She saw Thorne as a necessary eccentric, a man paid to worry about hypothetical apocalypses while she dealt with the tangible threats of piracy and secessionist movements. She listened to his presentation with a practiced patience, her gaze fixed on the map displaying the advancing wave of silence. "So, you're telling me a patch of space has gotten quiet," she said, her voice laced with skepticism. "Forgive me, Doctor, but my fleets are stretched thin dealing with actual threats, not phantom quiet zones." Eris leaned forward, his usual academic calm replaced by a raw urgency. "Commander, think about our own history. When has humanity ever advanced in silence? Our expansion was loud, chaotic, broadcasting our existence with every radio wave and engine burn. An entity that can silence the universe as it moves is not an explorer. It is a hunter. It is hiding its approach. And you only do that when you have no intention of introducing yourself. You do it when you intend to strike from the dark." Rostova's skepticism wavered, replaced by a flicker of professional curiosity. What kind of technology could even do that? A localized warp field, a gravitic distortion. It's beyond anything we can conceive of, Eris admitted, and that is precisely why we must assume it is hostile. Look at the trajectory. It's headed directly for the Titan shipyards, our primary naval construction facility. It isn't random. It knows where to hurt us. The commander was silent for a long moment, her fingers drumming a restless tattoo on the table. She pulled up the deployment records for the sector. The 3rd and 5th fleets were the closest, but they were outfitted for riot control and anti-piracy patrols, not at a full-scale engagement with an unknown foe. Their ships were fast and maneuverable, designed to fight other human ships in skirmishes over resources or ideology. They were not built to face a void that swallowed stars. She looked at Eris, her eyes hard. "Your theory is based on historical precedent, on the idea that a silent predator is the most dangerous. If you're wrong, I'll be reassigning fleets and leaving critical sectors vulnerable for nothing." "I know," Eris replied, his voice low, "but if I'm right, and we do nothing, those fleets won't matter anyway." He pointed to a file on his datapad, a simulation he had run based on the advancing null field. It was a projection of a first strike scenario, a decapitation blow aimed at humanity's industrial heart. The casualty estimates were in the billions. Rostova stared at the numbers, her jaw tightening. She gave the order. The third and fifth fleets were to converge at a rally point just beyond the Titan shipyards to form a defensive line and await the arrival of whatever was hiding in the quiet. It was a gamble, a massive reallocation of resources based on the historical anxieties of a scholar. As the fleets moved into position, Eris Thorn could only watch the data streams and pray that, for once in his life, his understanding of humanity's violent nature was wrong. He wasn't. The Athelian scout fleet dropped from their silent advance with the grace of falling silk. One moment, there was only the cold, empty void. The next, Titai monolithic vessels hung in space. Their forms so geometrically perfect they seemed to reject the natural untidiness of the cosmos. They did not power up weapons or raise shields in a show of aggression. They simply existed, their presence an undeniable statement of superiority. A single galaxy-wide transmission was broadcast on all frequencies, a calm, melodic voice that spoke in a synthesized version of every human language at once. It was not a declaration of war, but a proclamation of pacification. The message spoke of humanity as a contagion, a chaotic anomaly that had unfortunately survived its expected extinction. For the good of galactic harmony, it explained, this oversight was to be corrected. The species would be pacified, its worlds cleansed and brought into the serene fold of the hegemony. It was the voice of a god announcing an apocalypse, devoid of malice or anger, filled only with a serene, absolute certainty. Aboard the human flagship, the stalwart Admiral Gian, a veteran of a dozen brutal skirmishes, watched the Athelian fleet with a mixture of awe and fury. Their ships were 10 times the size of his largest dreadnought, and the energy readings they gave off were astronomical. He turned to the comms officer. "Do we have Commander Rostova?" "She's patched in, Admiral," came the reply. Rostova's face appeared on the main view screen, grim and resolute. "Well, Dr. Thorne gets to say, 'I told you so,'" she said, her voice tight. "What are your orders?" Admiral Gian looked at the enemy fleet, then at the meager collection of human ships arrayed against them. "We hold the line. They want Titan. They have to go through us. Send a priority message to High Command. Tell them the boogeymen are real." As the human ships brace for impact, Eris Thorne, watching from the relative safety of Aegis Station, felt a cold dread mix with a strange sense of vindication. He had spent his life studying the art of war, and he knew that this was not a battle humanity could win with brute force. The hegemony was too powerful, too advanced. They would be crushed in a conventional engagement. He frantically opened a channel to Rostova's command ship, his mind racing through millennia of conflicts, searching for a precedent, for any strategy that had allowed the weak to defeat the strong. "Commander," he said, his voice urgent, "do not engage them head-on. You can't win a fight of strength." Rostova's reply was curt. "I'm open to suggestions. Doctor, look at their formation," Eris said, pointing to the perfectly symmetrical lines of the Athelian fleet. "It's flawless, ordered, serene. They have not known a real war in 10,000 years. Their tactics are based on overwhelming force, not on adaptation. They expect us to charge at them. They expect us to break against their shields like a wave against a cliff. So, what do you suggest? A tactical retreat? We don't have anywhere to run." "No," Eris insisted. "You have to be unpredictable. You have to be chaotic. You have to use the one thing they've bred out of themselves, desperation." He pulled up a stellar chart of the system. "You see that gas giant? Hyperion. Its magnetic field is unstable, prone to massive coronal ejections if stimulated with the right energy frequency, and its ring system is filled with debris, ice, and rock. It's messy. It's chaotic. It's everything they despise. Lure them into the rings. Use the debris as cover. Overload their sensors with the system's natural noise. Fight dirty. On the bridge of the Stalwart, Admiral Gian and Commander Rostova exchanged a look. It was a suicidal plan, Flying a fleet through Hyperion's rings during a magnetic storm was just as likely to destroy their own ships as it was the enemy's. But it was also completely insane, a tactic so reckless and illogical that a species as ordered as the Aethelians would never anticipate it. It was a purely human solution. "Do it," Rostova commanded, her voice ringing with newfound resolve. "All ships, execute evasive maneuver Epsilon. Set a course for the Hyperion rings. We're going to give these bastards a taste of chaos." As the small, agile human fleet broke formation and scattered, diving towards the turbulent rings of the gas giant, the Aethelian Imperator watched from his tranquil command deck with a flicker of confusion. This was not the honorable, final charge of a doomed species he had expected. This was disorganized. This was messy. This was primitive. And for the first time in 1,000 years, Imperator Vorlog felt a stirring of something he could not immediately identify, a faint, discordant note in the perfect silence of his dominion. It was the feeling of uncertainty. The transition was jarring, a violent shift from the silent, open void to a maelstrom of sound and fury. Alarms blared across the bridge of the Stalwart as the human fleet plunged into the swirling chaos of Hyperion's rings, chunks of ice and rock, some as small as a fist and others the size of a shuttle, hammered against the ship's kinetic barriers, creating a deafening drumbeat that vibrated through the hull. On the main view screen, the serene starscape was replaced by a hypnotic, deadly dance of debris, all of it backlit by the ominous glow of the gas giant below. This was a battlefield of pure chance, a realm where precision targeting was useless and survival depended on instinct and luck. Aboard the Eternal Resolve, prognosticator Lyra watched the human ships vanish into the cosmic storm and felt a tremor of what could almost be described as admiration. They were not just hiding. They were embracing an environment that should have destroyed them. They were using the universe's own untidiness as a shield. Imperator Vorlog, however, saw only the desperate flailing of a cornered animal. They sully the void with their cowardice, he intoned, his voice resonating with contempt. They seek refuge in filth, hoping to escape their purification. He turned to his fleet commander, his golden optics glowing with cold resolve. "Follow them. Our vessels are superior. The environment is an irrelevant variable. Calibrate shield harmonics to deflect micro-meteoroids and advance in standard pacification formation. We will sweep through this garbage heap and erase them." Lyra stepped forward, her expression uncharacteristically urgent. "Imperator, that is what they expect. Their historical records are filled with tales of weaker forces using terrain to their advantage. They call it guerrilla warfare. They are drawing us into a field of their own choosing, where our technological superiority is mitigated." Vorlag's helmeted head swiveled slowly to face her. "Are you suggesting, prognosticator, that 10 millennia of hegemonic perfection can be mitigated by a cloud of frozen rock? We are the Aethelian hegemony. We do not adapt to the battlefield. The battlefield adapts to us, or it is sterilized." His order was absolute. The gleaming, monolithic Aethelian warships, built for the elegant geometry of open space combat, voiced forward into the rings. Their advance was slow, methodical, and profoundly arrogant. Their powerful sensors, designed to detect the subtle energy signatures of cloaked ships from light years away, were instantly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of noise, the crackle of static electricity, the magnetic flux of the gas giant. and the constant, chaotic pings of millions of pieces of debris. For the first time, the hegemony was flying blind. The first attack came without warning. 3 human corvettes, their hulls painted a dull and non-reflective gray that made them nearly indistinguishable from the larger asteroids. Detached from their magnetic clamps on a massive chunk of iron ore, they fell upon the rearmost Ethelian cruiser like wolves on a stray bison. The hegemony vessel's energy weapons, designed for long-range engagements, struggled to track the small, big, agile ships darting between pieces of cover. The human ships, in contrast, were armed with primitive but brutally effective mass drivers, magnetic cannons that hurled solid slugs of tungsten at near-relativistic speeds. These kinetic projectiles were useless against Ethelian shields in open space, where they could be easily tracked and vaporized. But here, at point-blank range, they were devastating. The slugs slammed into the cruiser's hull, bypassing the energy shields entirely and punching through layers of pristine armor. The Ethelian ship, which had not suffered a single scratch in 500 years of service, shuddered as entire sections vented atmosphere into the void. It was a shallow wound, but it was a wound nonetheless, a mark of imperfection that sent a ripple of disbelief through the Ethelian fleet. On Aegis Station, Eris Thorn was a man possessed, his eyes darting between a dozen data streams. The battle was not a single engagement, but 1,000 simultaneous skirmishes, and he was trying to find the rhythm in the chaos. He wasn't just watching, he was learning. Commander Rostova, he broadcast directly to the fleet's command channel. Their response time to attacks on their ventral side is 1.7 seconds slower than their dorsal. They prioritize protecting their command towers. They're predictable, and their shield modulation is pattern-based. They're cycling frequencies to counter the debris field. If you can time a missile strike to hit between the cycles. His voice was a constant stream of information, turning human desperation into a calculated science. He was weaponizing his knowledge of history, applying the timeless principles of asymmetric warfare to this impossible conflict. Commander Rostova, her knuckles white as she gripped a railing on the stalwart's bridge, translated Thorn's academic analysis into brutal, efficient orders. All squadrons focus fire on their underbellies. Use the sensor ghosts as decoys. Wait for my mark to fire missile salvos. Let's make them bleed. The human fleet became a part of the storm. They used grav whips to slingshot around asteroids, appearing from unexpected angles. They detonated small demolition charges on icy comets, creating dense clouds of shrapnel to screen their movements. They fought with a vicious, cornered animal ferocity that the Ethelians, in their long, placid history, had never encountered. War, for the hegemony, was a stately affair, a matter of overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. This was not war. This was a brawl in a dark alley, and the humans were fighting like they had nothing to lose. Aboard the Eternal Resolve, reports of minor hull breaches and shield fluctuations began to flood the command deck. The damage was superficial, the losses statistically insignificant, yet the psychological impact was profound. The perfect silence of the bridge was broken by the quiet, persistent chime of damage alerts, each one a tiny crack in the hegemony's armor of invincibility. Imperator Vorlog watched the tactical display, his fists clenched. The human ships were like insects, swarming and stinging, impossible to pin down. His fleet, a collection of the most powerful warships in the galaxy, was being harassed and humiliated by a handful of obsolete relics. He slammed his gauntlet down on his command throne. "Focus fire!" he roared, his voice losing its serene calm for the first time, replaced by a raw, guttural anger. "I want their flagship, the Stalwart. Pin it down and obliterate it. make an example of their defiance. The Athelian fleet, responding to the raw emotion in their leader's voice, began to shift its strategy. They abandoned their rigid formation, their ships surging forward with newfound aggression, their energy beams cutting brilliant, destructive paths through the debris field. They were no longer trying to pacify, they were trying to kill, and in doing so, they were beginning to make mistakes. They're getting angry, Eris Thorn observed, a grim satisfaction in his voice. They're becoming emotional. Keep provoking them. Commander, anger makes you predictable. Draw Admiral Gion's wing into the Serpent's Coil. The Serpent's Coil was a particularly treacherous section of the rings, a dense cluster of asteroids locked in a complex orbital resonance, creating gravitational eddies and unpredictable currents. It was a death trap. Admiral Gion, leading a squadron of destroyers, didn't hesitate. He led his ships on a feigned retreat, drawing a dozen Athelian cruisers in pursuit. The massive hegemony ships, built for stability and grace, struggled to navigate the treacherous currents, their inertial dampeners working overtime. Gion's smaller, more nimble destroyers, however, danced through the chaos, their pilots flying on pure instinct. Prognosticator Lyra watched the pursuing cruisers on the tactical display, a sense of dread coiling in her gut. She overlaid their trajectory with the star charts from the derelict human ship, the one that had started this whole affair. The charts were not just maps, they were warnings. They highlighted stellar phenomena, gravitational anomalies, and environmental hazards. She cross-referenced the Serpent's Coil with the human data. Her blood ran cold. Imperator, she cried out, her voice sharp with alarm. It's a trap. The human logs call that region a magnetar echo. The gas giant's magnetic field is amplified in that sector. A significant energy release could trigger a resonance cascade, but it was too late. Vorlog, blinded by his rage and his desperate need to crush the humans' infuriating defiance, saw only that his prey was cornered. Unleash the primary cannon. He commanded the lead cruiser. Crack that asteroid they are hiding behind and expose them. The Athelian cruiser obeyed. A beam of pure, white-hot energy, capable of boiling the surface of a moon, lanced out and struck the massive iron asteroid Admiral Gion's ships were using for cover. The asteroid vaporized instantly. But the colossal energy discharge, injected directly into the most volatile part of Hyperion's magnetic field, was the spark Eris Thorn had been waiting for. The effect was instantaneous and spectacular. The gas giant responded as if it had been struck by a giant whip. A wave of shimmering, multicolored energy, a coronal mass ejection of unprecedented scale, erupted from the planet's upper atmosphere. It surged through the Serpent's Coil not as a gentle wave, but as a cosmic tsunami of pure electromagnetic force. The human ships, having anticipated the blast, had already diverted all power to their polarized shield emitters, their rugged, over-engineered systems groaning under the strain, but holding. The Athelian ships were not so fortunate. Their delicate, hyper-efficient systems were exquisitely sensitive. The electromagnetic pulse hit them like a physical blow. Shields flickered and died. Navigation systems went haywire. Sophisticated energy cannons overloaded and exploded in silent, brilliant flashes of light. The dozen cruisers that had pursued Admiral Gian were left adrift. Their systems fried, their perfect hulls now scarred and powerless. The rest of the Athelian fleet, caught in the wider blast, suffered system-wide failures and debilitating malfunctions. Their perfect or orderly advance had devolved into a chaotic rout on the bridge of the Eternal Resolve, which had been far enough away to weather the worst of the blast. Imperator Vorlog stared at the tactical display in stunned silence. Nearly a quarter of his fleet was disabled or destroyed, not by enemy weapons, but by the very universe itself, wielded as a weapon by a species he had dismissed as insignificant. The symphony of the hegemony had been shattered by a blast of cosmic noise. Humiliated and enraged, he gave the order that was anathema to his entire culture retreat. The surviving Aetholian ships, their pristine elegance marred by scorch marks and battle scars, disengaged from the rings and warped back into the clean, orderly silence of deep space. As the last Aetholian energy signature faded, a ragged cheer erupted on the bridge of the Stalwart. They had done it. They had faced the perfect enemy and had given them a bloody nose. But as Commander Rostova looked at her own fleet's damage reports, the crippled ships, the mounting casualties, she knew this was not a victory. It was a reprieve. They had not defeated the hegemony. They had only made it angry. And now, the galaxy's most powerful empire knew that humanity was not just a weed to be pruned, but a rival philosophy of existence that had to be stamped out, not with serene pacification, but with absolute, unrestrained force. The real war was just beginning. The retreat of the Aetholian hegemony was more shocking than their arrival. It was a violation of natural law, an event so contrary to the established order of the galaxy that for a long moment, the human fleet simply drifted in the bruised and battered rings of Hyperion, caught in a collective state of disbelief. The silence that followed was not the serene and imposed silence of the hegemony, but the hollow, ringing silence of a near-death experience. Aboard the Stalwart, the ragged cheers had died down, replaced by the grim litany of damage control reports and casualty lists. Victory felt indistinguishable from ruin. Commander Rostova stood on the bridge, the adrenaline of battle leaving her feeling hollowed out and brittle. They had survived. They had won. And in doing so, they had signed their own death warrant. She knew, with the chilling certainty of a veteran commander, that the hegemony would not make the same mistakes again. They had been provoked, humiliated. The next time they came, it would not be for pacification. It would be for eradication. She opened a secure channel to Aegis Station, her face a mask of exhaustion. "Thorn, talk to me!" Eris Thorn's face materialized on her screen. He looked as if he hadn't slept in a week, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity, but he was not exhausted. He was energized. "They have a weakness. Commander," he began, foregoing any pleasantries. "It's their greatest strength. Perfection. Order. Their entire civilization is a single, perfectly tuned machine. But what happens when you introduce a dissonant note into a perfect symphony? It doesn't just sound bad, it causes a systemic collapse." Rostova rubbed her temples. "I'm not in the mood for metaphors, Doctor. We just lost 12% of our fleet, and we were lucky. What's your point?" "My point," Eris said, pulling up a complex diagram of the Aetholian command structure derived from their battle communications, "is that they don't have a true chain of command. They have a flow of consensus. Orders don't travel down. They emanate outwards from the Imperator. Every ship, every soldier is a node in a single, unified consciousness. They act as one because, in a way, they think as one. We saw it when they got angry. The entire fleet became reckless. Vorlog's rage became their rage." A chilling realization dawned on Rostova. "You're saying their unity is a vulnerability. If we could disrupt that central consciousness, we could paralyze them," Eris finished. "Not with an EMP or a virus in the traditional sense. We need to infect them with an idea, with a paradox, with chaos itself. We need to introduce a piece of information so contrary to their worldview that their unified mind cannot process it, forcing a system-wide schism. The sheer audacity of the idea was staggering. It was a plan that transcended military strategy and entered the realm of psychological and philosophical warfare. And how exactly do you plan to upload a philosophical paradox into an alien hive mind in the middle of a war? Rostova asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. We can't, Eris admitted. Not from the outside. Their networks are flawless, but we saw their arrogance. They followed us into the rings. They believe their systems are inviolable. We need to get a message in, but to do that, we need a key. We need to understand the architecture of their mind, their language, not just the words, but the concepts that underpin their entire reality. We need a source. He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. We need to capture one of them, not a soldier in an armored suit. We need a mind, a command-level officer, a prognosticator. The silence on the Ithelian command deck was no longer serene. It was heavy, suffocating, thick with the shame of their first defeat in living memory as the flawless chrome of the bulkheads seemed tarnished, reflecting the fractured state of their collective confidence. Imperator Vorlog stood before the High Council, a conclave of beings so ancient and powerful they rarely convened. His rage had cooled, forged by the cold vacuum of space into something far more dangerous: absolute, unwavering purpose. The humans, he declared, his voice a low, chilling monotone that held none of its previous melodic calm, were not a species. They were a disease of thought. Their existence was a logical fallacy, a chaotic variable that threatened the very equation of the universe. The strategy of pacification, he admitted, had been a failure, an assumption based on the flawed premise that they were a rational species who would recognize the perfection of the hegemony and submit to it. He now understood that they did not comprehend perfection. They were antithetical to it. Therefore, they could not be absorbed. They must be erased. He unveiled his new strategy, a plan so final and absolute it drew a collective gasp from the assembled council. It was called the Requiem Protocol. It was not a weapon that targeted ships or cities, but one that targeted the very fabric of a system's reality. It was a gravitic resonance engine, a device that could create a localized, cascading space-time distortion. It would not cause a star to go nova or a planet to explode. It would cause the system to simply, cease to exist. Its matter and energy folded into a pocket dimension, leaving behind nothing but a perfect, unblemished void. It was the ultimate expression of the hegemonic will, the power to edit reality itself, to remove a dissonant note not by silencing it, but by unwriting the music entirely. The council, shaken by their defeat and terrified by the unpredictable nature of the human threat, gave their unanimous assent. The Requiem engine, an ancient and forbidden technology, would be reactivated. While the great weapon was prepared, a new fleet would be assembled, one designed not for elegant combat, but for brutal, overwhelming assault. They would learn from their mistakes. They would incorporate unpredictability into their battle simulations. They would study the human concept of fighting dirty. They would become the perfect predators. Prognosticator Lyra listened to the Imperator's proclamation with a growing sense of horror. This was not the act of a galactic gardener pruning a weed. This was the act of a god throwing a tantrum, willing to burn down the entire garden to kill a single bug. She saw the flaw in Vorlog's logic. He was trying to defeat chaos by applying an even greater, more absolute form of order. But her brief study of the humans suggested that they thrived under pressure. They did not break. They became harder. sharper, more innovative. To threaten them with total annihilation was not to cow them into submission, but to unleash their full, terrifying potential. Quietly, in the secret confines of her own mind, she made a decision. Vorlog's path would lead only to mutual destruction. She had to understand the humans, not to defeat them, but to find another way. While the hegemony rearmed for a war of annihilation, Lyra began her own secret war, a war for information. She reactivated the deep-level analysis of the data from the derelict human ship, the Odyssey, bypassing the standard threat assessment filters and opening the raw cultural files. She plunged into the chaotic, contradictory, and utterly compelling world of human history, of their art, their music, their philosophy. She read their poetry of love and their treatise on genocide. She watched their films of breathtaking heroism and their recordings of abject cruelty. She was appalled, confused, and dangerously fascinated. The mission was codenamed Ghost in the Machine. The vessel chosen was a prototype stealth scout, the Whisper, a ship so new its paint was barely dry. It was small, fast, and equipped with an experimental cloaking system that didn't just bend light but also mimicked the background radiation of the surrounding space, making it a functional black hole to most sensors. Its crew was a hand-picked team of 4 Major Kalin, a stoic Special Forces veteran to lead the op, Dr. Lena Petrova, a xenolinguist and psychologist tasked with making sense of their potential captive, a wisecracking pilot known only as Jax, and, at Commander Rostova's insistence, Dr. Eris Thorn. "I need you there, Thorn," she had told him. "You're the only one who knows what questions to ask. You understand their madness." Their target was an Ethelian listening post on a rogue planetoid in the Oort cloud of a neighboring system, designated Outpost Epsilon. It was isolated, lightly defended, and, according to salvaged battle data, staffed by a high-ranking prognosticator. It was a perfect target for a snatch and grab. As the Whisper slipped silently from its hidden dock, Eris felt a profound sense of temporal vertigo. He had spent his entire life looking backward, taunting the ghosts of the past. Now he was rocketing towards a future he could barely comprehend, on a mission to capture a being from a 10,000-year-old empire to steal the secrets of its mind. The ship engaged its Whisper drive, a variant of the FTL engine that created almost no temporal wake, and the stars outside the viewport dissolved into a serene, featureless gray. For 3 days, they traveled in silence. The only sounds the hum of the life support and the quiet tapping of Lena Petrova as she reviewed hypothetical first contact scenarios. Eris used the time to study the few fragments of Ethelian language they had been able to decipher. It was a language of pure mathematics, elegant and precise, with no words for concepts like guesswork, luck, or improvisation. How could he possibly communicate the chaotic, messy, beautifully flawed concept of humanity to a being whose very language denied its existence? "Approaching the target system," Jax announced, his casual tone belying the tension in the cockpit. "Going dark." The ship dropped out of FTL, and the cloak engaged. Before them lay a field of frozen debris, and nestled within it, almost invisible against the black, was Outpost Epsilon. It was not a fortress, but a delicate, crystalline structure that seemed to have grown out of the rock, its spires glowing with a soft, internal light. It was beautiful, serene, and utterly alien. They were a tiny spark of human chaos, about to bring their fire to a place of perfect, sterile order. Eris felt a tremor of fear, but it was overshadowed by a historian's insatiable curiosity. He was about to come face to face with the mind of his enemy, to look into the soul of perfection itself, And he had a terrible, thrilling suspicion that it would not be as perfect as it believed. The infiltration of Outpost Epsilon was a masterclass in controlled chaos. Jax, the pilot, guided the Whisper through the station's passive sensor net with the delicate touch of a safecracker, his fingers dancing across the controls. He used the gravitational fields of passing comets as slingshots and timed their movements to coincide with solar flares from the distant star, using the universe's natural noise to mask their unnatural silence. They docked not at a designated port, but on a shadowed underside of the planetoid, using magnetic clamps to latch onto the frozen rock like a parasitic insect. The silence inside the ship was absolute, each crew member breathing with shallow, measured care. Major Kalen was the first out, his movements fluid and economical in his matte black combat hardsuit. He secured their position and established a perimeter before signaling for the others. The surface of the planetoid was a landscape of jagged, crystalline ice, and the Athelian outpost rose from it like a perfectly sculpted icicle, glowing with a soft, ethereal light. There were no visible guards, no automated turrets, no obvious signs of defense. The hegemony's arrogance was their shield. The very idea of a lesser species daring to set foot on their sacred ground was a logical impossibility they had not accounted for. Eris Thorne felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold as he stepped onto the alien rock. He was a scholar, a man of archives and data streams, and he was now an invader on an alien world. The mission plan was simple in theory, terrifying in practice. Kalen and his silent partner, a hulking commando named Rex, would cut their way into a maintenance conduit and disable the internal sensors. Meanwhile, Eris and Dr. Petrova would follow, their job to identify and isolate the prognosticator. They moved through the service tunnels like ghosts. The only sounds the faint crunch of their boots on the metallic grating and the hum of unseen energies in the walls. The Athelian architecture was unnervingly beautiful, all sweeping curves and flawless, seamless junctions. There was no grime, no wear, no sign of imperfection. It was like walking through the physical manifestation of a mathematical formula. They reached the designated observation point, a ventilation panel overlooking the station's central data nexus. Kalen sliced through the grate with a cold fusion torch, creating a narrow slit for them to peer through. The chamber below was vast and silent, filled with pillars of pulsing, crystalline light that served as data cores. And moving among them was a single-sized slender figure in flowing silver robes. It was an Athelian, its form tall and graceful, its movements possessing an unearthly poise. "That's our target," Petrova whispered, her voice barely audible over their private comms. "The biosignature matches the profile of a prognosticator. High-level cognitive function, minimal physical augmentation. It's a being of pure thought." Eris stared, mesmerized. He had expected an enemy, a monster, but the being below radiated an aura of profound, scholarly calm. It was not a soldier, it was a librarian. As he watched, the prognosticator paused, its head tilting slightly, as if listening to a sound no one else could hear. It turned its featureless, silver face directly toward their hiding spot. A soft and melodic voice, impossibly, echoed not over a speaker system, but directly inside their minds. "The dissonance is intriguing. Your presence is an anomaly, a chaotic variable in a closed system. You are human, are you not?" The psychic contact was a physical blow. Eris stumbled back, gasping, clutching his head. Kalen immediately raised his pulse rifle, but Petrova put a hand on his arm. "Hold! It's not an attack. It's communication. Eris steadied himself, his mind reeling. They had been discovered. The mission was a failure, but the prognosticator's mental voice was not hostile. It was filled with a palpable sense of curiosity. He took a breath and focused his thoughts, pushing a single simple concept towards the being below. Why the answer came back instantly. A flood of complex emotional and logical data that was almost overwhelming. It was a projection of frustration, of a mind trapped in a system it could no longer reconcile. It was the voice of prognosticator Lyra. Because perfection has become a cage, she projected. My people have forgotten how to learn. They only know how to repeat. You are something new, something that does not fit the equation. I must understand. This changed everything. Their mission of abduction had just become a potential defection. Major, Eris said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Change of plan. We're not taking a prisoner. We're getting an informant. The escape from Outpost Epsilon was far louder than the entry. The moment Lyra willingly left the data nexus to join them, the station's automated systems registered the deviation from protocol. The serene quiet was shattered by a piercing, harmonic alarm. Bulkheads slammed shut, and sleek, white security drones deployed from hidden panels in the walls, their energy weapons humming to life. Kalen and Rex laid down a precise, brutal curtain of covering fire, their pulse rifles turning the elegant drones into showers of shattered porcelain and sparking circuits. Jax, back on the Whisper, hot-wired the station's external docking clamps from his remote console, causing a cascade of system failures that created a vital distraction. They sprinted back through the corridors, Lyra moving with a speed and agility that belied her delicate frame. She seemed to anticipate the station's response, guiding them through shifting maintenance tunnels and overriding security doors with a mere thought. She was not just a defector, she was a saboteur, dismantling her own cage from the inside. They made it back to the ship just as heavy Ethelian patrol vessels warped into the system, drawn by the station's distress signal. The Whisper detached from the planetoid and rocketed into the debris field, Jax pushing the experimental engines to their breaking point. The chase was a desperate, high-stakes game of cat and mouse through a field of cosmic buckshot. Ethelian energy beams, precise and deadly, sliced through asteroids, narrowly missing their cloaked hull. But Lyra was now their navigator. Her mind, linked to the hegemony's fleet-wide tactical network, became their ultimate weapon. They are executing search pattern Gamma 7, her voice echoed in their minds. They will converge on our projected exit vector in 34 seconds. Pilot, I suggest an immediate course correction through the heart of that ice comet. Jax let out a whoop of manic glee. You heard the lady hang on? He plunged the Whisper directly into the massive, spinning chunk of ice, the ship's thermal shields flaring as they carved a molten tunnel through its core. They emerged from the other side just as the Ethelian ships converged on their old position, their weapons firing into empty space. They had made it. They had their ghost in the machine. The debriefing took place in a sterile, white room on Aegis Station. The only sound the quiet hum of the air recyclers. Prognosticator Lyra sat at the center of the room, not as a prisoner, but as a guest. Her silver robes a stark contrast to the utilitarian gray of the human military uniforms. She did not speak aloud, but projected her thoughts directly into the minds of Commander Rostova and a stunned Eris Thorn. Her story was a confirmation of their worst fears. She revealed the existence of the Requiem Protocol, the weapon that could unmake entire star systems. She described the new Ethelian fleet being assembled, a fleet designed to counter human chaos with cold, calculated brutality. The hegemony was no longer content to pacify. They were rearming for a war of total annihilation. Your victory at Hyperion was a catalyst, Lyra explained, her mental voice tinged with a sorrow that felt ancient and profound. You did not just defeat a fleet, you defeated an idea, the idea of our own infallibility. It broke something in our collective consciousness. Now, my people are driven by a force they have not felt in 10,000 years, fear. They will do anything to extinguish the source of that fear. Rostova's face was grim. So they're gonna wipe us off the map with a reality-warping superweapon. How do we fight that? You cannot fight it. Lyra stated simply. The Requiem engine is not a weapon in the conventional sense. It is a tool of cosmic editing. To stop it, you cannot destroy it. You must convince the one who wields it not to press the button. You must break the will of the Imperator. Eris leaned forward, his mind racing. You said their unity is their weakness. If Vorlag is the focal point, what happens if he is removed? His consciousness would be absorbed back into the hegemonic whole. Lyra explained. Another Imperator would be chosen, one with the same unyielding purpose. You cannot kill your way out of this problem. You must think your way out. You must infect their system with a concept so alien to their logic that it forces a reevaluation of their core principles. And what concept is that? Rostova asked. Lyra turned her featureless face towards Eris Thorn. The one your species seems to have perfected, even if you do not understand it, the concept of a noble sacrifice, the logic of dying for a belief, to the hegemony. Survival is the only logical imperative. The idea of choosing extinction to protect an ideal is a paradox they cannot compute. It is a logical virus. Eris felt a profound weight settle on his shoulders. The fate of humanity rested not on the strength of its warships or the cleverness of its tactics, but on his ability to distill the chaotic, contradictory, bloody, and beautiful history of his species into a single, weaponized idea. He had to teach the perfect enemy the meaning of being imperfectly human. He had to build a logic bomb, and the only explosive material he had was the story of humanity itself. The final battle for Earth was not a battle. It was a last stand, a final, defiant roar against the encroaching, perfect silence. The new Ethelian fleet was a thing of terrible beauty, a collection of warships that had shed their ceremonial elegance for brutalist function. They moved not in stately formation, but with the fluid, predatory grace of a wolf pack. Their hulls a dark, non-reflective obsidian that seemed to drink the light of stars. At the heart of this armada of death hung the eternal resolve, and beside it, the Requiem engine. A monstrous latticework of crystalline conduits and gravitic lenses that pulsed with a sickening non-color, actively warping the space around it. Humanity threw everything it had left at the approaching tide. Battered destroyers, retrofitted civilian freighters with mining lasers bolted to their hulls, and sleek, desperate interceptors formed a ragged line of defense around their home world. It was a fleet powered by desperation, a last wall of flesh and steel against a god's wrath. Their goal was not to win, but to buy minutes, to give the architect of their only hope the time he needed to build their final weapon. In a shielded laboratory deep within Aegis Station, Eris Thorn worked with a frantic, obsessive focus. He was no longer just a historian, he was a composer, and his symphony was the sum of human existence. Working alongside a humbled Lyra and a fascinated Dr. Petrova, he wove together the data packet that would be their logic bomb. It was not a simple text file or a string of code. It was a multi-sensory, psychoactive narrative, a curated explosion of human experience designed to be utterly indigestible to the hegemonic mind. It began with the foundational paradox, a recording of the first primitive human creating a tool, followed immediately by a recording of the first human using that same tool as a weapon. It contained the poetry of Sappho and the battlefield orders of Genghis Khan. It held the soaring music of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony overlaid with the frantic screams from the sacking of Carthage. It showed them footage of a mother shielding her child with her own body during a bombing raid, then showed them the schematics of the very bomb that was falling. It was a torrent of love, hate, creation, destruction, faith, and despair. At its core, Eris embedded the stories of sacrifice, a soldier throwing himself on a grenade to save his comrades, a scientist knowingly exposing herself to lethal radiation to prevent a meltdown, a firefighter walking into a collapsing building to search for a single, lost child. Every note in this chorus of chaos was designed to ask the Ithilian mind a question it could not answer. Why would a creature choose to die for something other than its own survival? The delivery system was as audacious as the message itself. A single heavily modified frigate, stripped of all non-essential systems and packed with every engine booster and shield modulator they could find, was christened the Forlorn Hope. Its mission was to do the impossible, to punch through the most advanced fleet in the galaxy, reach the Eternal Resolve, and at point-blank range, transmit the data packet directly into the hegemony's central consciousness. It was a suicide mission in the purest sense. Its pilot would be Commander Eva Rostova. "It has to be me, Thorn," she said, her voice devoid of any drama as she stood with him before the mission briefing. "They saw me lead the fleet at Hyperion. They know I represent our will to fight. When I deliver your message, my action will be the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. The pragmatist committing the ultimate act of illogical faith. It completes the paradox." Eris could only nod, his throat tight with a sorrow so profound it felt like a physical weight. He, the man of words and ideas, would remain behind while the woman of action and steel would become the vessel for his final argument. He handed her a data chip containing the chorus of chaos. "It's all in there," he said, his voice hoarse. "Everything we are. The good, the bad, everything." Rostova took the chip and looked at him, her hard eyes softening for a fraction of a second. "Make sure they remember why," she said. Then she turned and walked away. A soldier going to fight her last war, not with a weapon, but with a story. The battle began. The human fleet charged. A chaotic, glorious, and doomed assault. Ships exploded in brilliant, silent blossoms of light, their crews selling their lives to carve a momentary path through the Ithilian onslaught. And through that fleeting corridor of fire and death, the Forlorn Hope flew like an avenging angel. It dodged and weaved, its shields flaring and dying and regenerating, its hull glowing cherry red from weapons fire and atmospheric friction as it dove into the heart of the enemy fleet. On the bridge of the Eternal Resolve, Imperator Vorlog watched the single ship's suicidal approach with cold contempt. An open channel crackled to life, and Rostova's face, bruised, bloodied, but unbroken, appeared on his view screen. "You see this, Vorlog," she spat, her voice a ragged gasp. "One ship, one last, desperate act. You think this is an attack? You're wrong. This is a gift. The gift of your own extinction. Human." Vorlog's voice boomed. Serene once more in the face of his imminent, perfect victory. "It is a gift we are pleased to grant." "No," Rostova said, a faint, bloody smile touching her lips. the gift of a choice. With her last ounce of strength, she slammed her fist down on the console. The chorus of chaos, the story of humanity, was unleashed. The forlorn hope did not just transmit a signal, it detonated its core, turning the ship itself into a focused, directional blast of pure data. A shotgun blast of raw information aimed directly at the soul of the hegemony. The effect was absolute. On the bridge of the eternal resolve, Imperator Vorlog froze, his hand outstretched toward the actuator for the Requiem protocol. All across the star-dusted battlefield, the Athelian fleet simply stopped. Their weapons fell silent. Their engines went cold. The unified consciousness of the hegemony, a perfect and serene ocean of thought that had existed for 10 millennia, was hit by the tsunami of human contradiction. It tried to process the illogical data. It tried to reconcile the concept of a mother's love with the logic of a nuclear bomb. It tried to understand why a soldier would die for a piece of colored cloth, why a commander would sacrifice herself not for victory, but for a message. The paradox was too great. The perfect equation had been given a variable it could not solve. And so, the machine broke. The single unified mind shattered into billions of individual points of consciousness. For the first time in an eternity, every Athelian soldier, technician, and commander was alone in their own head, adrift in a terrifying new sea of individuality. They were no longer a single deified god. They were a species, lost and afraid. The Requiem engine powered down, its baleful light fading into nothingness. The war was over. In the weeks that followed, the Athelian fleet did not flee. It simply remained, a silent, drifting memorial to a fallen god. Humanity, battered and bleeding but alive, had won an impossible victory. Eris Thorn stood on the bridge of the Stalwart, looking out at the silent enemy ships. Lyra stood beside him, her mental voice now soft, tinged with a profound and weary sadness, but also with a flicker of something new hope. "They are learning," she projected, gesturing to the silent fleet. "They are learning what it is to be I instead of we. They are learning doubt, fear, and wonder. You did not destroy us, Eris Thorn. You have set us free. It is a terrifying, painful freedom." Eris thought of Rostova and the countless others who had paid for this moment. He had weaponized the story of his species, and in doing so, had saved it. But he had also unleashed a new, uncertain future upon the galaxy. The age of perfect order was over, and a new age of chaos and choice had begun. He looked at the blue and white marble of Earth, hanging in the void, scarred but still beautiful, and finally understood the central truth of his species. Humanity's chaos was not a flaw or a disease. It was the engine of its survival, the source of its greatest cruelty and its most profound grace. They were not a perfect species, but in their flawed, contradictory, and sacrificial heart, they held the power to teach a god how to be mortal.